A starving boy collapsed outside her cabin. The widow sheltered him, and he never let her go. The wind that night carried no mercy. It came howling down from the Tetons, dragging snow like fists of salt hurled against the earth, rattling every loose board and shutter of the cabin. The Wyoming frontier had ways of reminding folks they were smaller than the land, and Martha Kincaid had long since learned to bow her head to its cruel sermons. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Inside the cabin, the fire was dying low, the embers pulsing like faint red eyes. Martha pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had lived through 3 winters alone since the range war took her husband. 3 winters of silence thick enough to choke her. Each night was a battle against memory as much as against the cold. She had just set her needlework aside when the sound reached her. At first it was faint, a trick the storm might have played. A cry that was not quite a cry, a muffled thud swallowed by the snow. Martha froze, listening. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest settlement, no sound came by accident. Another groan. This time, human. Martha snatched the rifle from the wall. Her pulse pounded hard enough to drown the storm as she unlatched the door. The wind tore it open, flinging snow into the cabin. She stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowed against the blizzard. There, at the edge of the woodpile, a shape crumpled in the snow. Her first thought was, bear cub, but then she saw the hand. Thin, human, bare fingers curled against the ice. Lord, above, she whispered. The boy lay face down, body shuddering once, then still. His clothes hung off him in tatters. No coat, only a ripped shirt, trousers, stiff with frost, and boots so worn they barely clung to his feet. He could not have weighed more than a scarecrow. Fear prickled Martha's spine. Outlaws sometimes used tricks like this, a half-dead decoy to lure pity before the real killers. Rode in. She scanned the tree line, rifle raised, but saw nothing but snow twisting in the wind. The boy gave a soft moan, and in that moment, fear gave way to something else, an ache deeper than hunger, sharper than the cold. Martha lowered the rifle, lunged forward, and hooked her arms beneath his shoulders. He was light, terrifyingly light, his head lolling against her chest as she dragged him toward the door. Every step fought the storm, boots sinking deep in the drift, but she hauled him inside at last and slammed the door shut behind them. The boy collapsed onto the plank floor, his breath ragged, lips tinged blue. Martha dropped to her knees. Stay. With me, son. Don't you let go. She stripped off his frozen shirt, revealing ribs like fence posts under skin bruised black and yellow. A scar crossed his shoulder, the kind left by a blade, half-healed but angry with infection. His hair, dark and matted with snow, clung to his forehead. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A faint beat. Faint, but there. Martha threw more wood on the fire until flames leapt high again. She heated water, rummaged for the last jar of lard, and rubbed it into his stiffened hands. She wrapped him in quilts, her husband's old coat among them, and forced a trickle of broth past his lips. For long minutes she worked in silence, the storm battering the cabin walls like a siege. Her mind raged with questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why was he alone out there in the killing cold? But those questions belonged to tomorrow. Tonight there was only this battle. To pull him back from the dark. The boy stirred once, eyes fluttering open. They were startling eyes, green flecked with amber, wild and terrified. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow. Hush. Now, Martha whispered. You're safe here. The words came strange to her own ears. She had not spoken them in years, not since she buried her husband and locked her heart against the world. But tonight, in this storm, she found herself saying them again. The boy's gaze locked on hers. His lips parted, trying for words. But no sound came. Then exhaustion claimed him, and his eyes rolled shut once more. Martha sat back, hands trembling. She glanced at the rifle leaning against the hearth, then at the boy curled beneath the blankets. Stranger or not, he had arrived. At her door near frozen, near starved, and by taking him in, she had crossed some line she could never uncross. Outside, the wind wailed against the cabin walls, Inside, the fire snapped and hissed. Martha knew life on the frontier was a ledger of choices, and everyone carried a price. Tonight, she had chosen mercy. Tomorrow, the reckoning would come. But for now, she stayed at the boy's side, watching the rise and fall of his fragile breath, listening to the storm beat against the world beyond. And for the first time in years, the silence inside her home was broken. The boy did not wake until the second morning. Martha had sat through the night beside him, feeding the fire and changing the damp cloth on his brow. Each hour, she wondered if she would find him gone when she next checked his breathing. But he clung stubbornly to life, the sound of his shallow breaths mixing with the crack of firewood, as if both fought the same battle against the cold. When dawn finally broke, it brought no comfort, only the gray hush of snow burying the hills outside. Martha poured herself a cup of black coffee and turned when she heard him stir. The boy's eyes blinked open again, green, sharp, mistrustful. He flinched when he realized he was in a stranger's home. His hand reached instinctively toward the floor as if searching for a weapon. "You won't find one," Martha said softly. "You're safe here. Leastwise, safer than out there." The boy said nothing. She crouched beside him, her voice steady. "Name's Martha Kincaid. This is my cabin. You came near freezing outside my door." Still silence. His eyes flicked. Around the room, the rifle leaning against the hearth, the heavy iron pot on the stove, the stacked firewood by the wall, measuring, assessing, like a trapped animal. Martha sighed. She remembered that look. Her husband had carried it back from the range war, the suspicion that lingered long after a fight was done. She pushed a bowl of broth toward him. "Eat if you've got the strength." His hands trembled as he lifted the spoon. Hunger overpowered mistrust. He devoured the broth in silence, eyes never leaving her face. "Eli," the word startled her. His voice was low, hoarse from disuse, but it was there. "Eli," he repeated. "That your name?" He gave the faintest nod. Martha studied him more, closely now. The sun-darkened skin, the black hair, the sharp lines of his jaw that carried echoes of both worlds, the pale frontier and the native plains. He was young, 16, 17 at most. But life had carved him harder than his years. She poured him another bowl. "Eli, then. You've come a long way to end up here." He said nothing more, only lowered his head and ate. For 3 days, Eli spoke no further. He worked in silence, too weak for heavy tasks, but insistent on chopping kindling, mending a broken hinge, hauling water from the creek. Martha led him, though she watched carefully, measuring the shadows under his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on the horizon. At night, she sometimes heard him cry out in his sleep, words tangled in another tongue. When she woke him, he would sit bolt upright, breathing hard, refusing to meet her eyes. She knew better than to press him. Trauma had its own time, its own bitter patience. But outside her walls, patience was rare. The snow broke after a week, leaving the land raw and glistening under the pale sun. Martha rode into town for supplies, her mare's hooves crunching through slush on the wagon trail. The settlement was little more than a scattering of false front buildings, saloon, general store, blacksmith, church. Men leaned on posts, spitting. Tobacco, their eyes narrowing as she passed. Martha had lived with that scrutiny for years now. Widowhood and independence were a kind of crime in their eyes. Inside the store, whispers reached her ears. Another raid on the valley ranches. Lost 2 men. Tracks in the snow. Said it was Shoshone this time. Half-breed scouts leading 'em, mark my words. Can't trust the bastards. Martha stiffened. She pretended to study the flour sacks, but the words burrowed under her skin. On the ride home, she kept glancing over her shoulder. Every tree seemed to hide a watcher, every shadow a threat. When she reached the cabin, Eli was splitting logs by the fence line. His shirt clung to his shoulders with sweat despite the cold. The sight of him there, brown-skinned, black-haired, suddenly carried new weight. If the men in town saw him, they would not see a boy. They would see a target. "Eli," she called sharply. Inside, he hesitated, axe poised, then obeyed. She closed the door and leaned against it, the rifle within reach. "You've enemies out there, don't you?" His silence was answer enough. Martha's throat tightened. "I buried my husband because of men who couldn't let go of hate. I won't bury another soul under my roof, so if you've brought danger to my door—" Eli's voice cut through, low and strained. "I didn't ask to be here." The words hung between them like a knife. Martha drew in a slow breath. He was right. She had chosen mercy that storming night, and mercy was never without cost. She softened her tone. "No, you didn't. But you're here now. And that makes you my responsibility." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, gratitude, fear, she could not tell. That night, she lay awake long after the fire had died down. Outside, the coyotes called across the valley, lonely and fierce. She turned toward the boy sleeping on the cot beside the hearth, his face softened by the glow of embers. Martha remembered her husband's last words before he rode into that feud. "Don't wait up. I'll be back by sundown." He never returned. She had built walls of silence since then, walls so high no one had crossed them. But now a starving boy had stumbled over them, and the sound of his breathing in her cabin was breaking the silence she had once thought she needed. Still, she knew the truth. In the Wild West, mercy was a dangerous thing. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Martha watched them fade into the dark and whispered into the silence, though he could not hear her. "God, help me, what have I brought into my home?" Outside, the wind rose again, carrying rumors and danger across the frozen hills. Inside, Martha listened to Eli's steady breathing, knowing that compassion had tied her fate to his, and that bond, fragile as it was, could cost them both their lives. The morning sun cracked through the storm clouds, laying a pale sheet of gold across the valley. Snow still clung to the fence posts and the roofs of the chicken coop, but the air had shifted, less bitter, almost tender, as though the land itself was easing its grip. Martha stepped out onto the porch with a bucket of feed in her hand. The earth smelled sharp, thawing beneath the frost. She paused when she saw Eli already at work, splitting wood with the axe, his arms rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat across the valley. His movements were deliberate, cautious but determined. He was still gaunt, ribs showing beneath his shirt, yet there was strength in him. Quiet, coiled strength. "Careful with that blade," she called, her voice even. "It'll cut through more than pine if you're not mindful." Eli looked up briefly. His face held no smile, but he gave a nod. For him, that nod was trust enough. The days began to find a rhythm. Eli tended to the chores without being asked. Hauling, buckets, mending the chicken coop door, fetching water from the creek where the ice was breaking into shards. He moved through Martha's cabin as if uncertain of his place, careful never to touch more than he was given. At first, silence hung between them like an unspoken law. But silence was something Martha knew well. She found comfort in it, especially when paired with the sound of Eli working nearby. The scrape of the axe, the creak of leather boots, the splash of water poured into the trough, and slowly, in the quiet, small gestures began to stitch a bond. One evening, as Martha kneaded dough at the table, Eli slipped a handful of dried berries onto the board. He must have foraged them from the ridge. She looked at him, startled. He did not meet her eyes, only murmured, "For the bread." Another night, when she woke coughing from the chill, she found the quilt tucked tighter around her shoulders. Eli was awake by the fire, pretending not to notice. They spoke little, yet something was being said in every action. It was Martha who broke the silence first. She was mending a saddle strap by lamplight, her fingers stiff, when she glanced up and saw Eli watching her work. His gaze was steady, curious. "My husband was the one with clever hands," she said, voice low. "Could fix anything that broke on this ranch. Fences, bridles, hearts." She gave a faint smile, though her eyes were distant. "When he died, I had to learn what was left behind. That's survival for you. No one asks if you're ready." Eli's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but she saw how his hands curled slightly, as though he too knew the weight of survival. She studied him in the lamplight, the way his face carried shadows deeper than his years. "What about you?" she asked softly. For a long moment, he was still. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he answered, "I was born between two worlds, belonging to neither." It was the most he had spoken. Martha did not press further. But in that single confession, she felt the raw wound of his life, loneliness deeper than hers, exile sharper than death. The thaw quickened. Snowmelt filled the creek, turning it wild and foaming. Together they repaired the fence that winter had toppled. Martha steadied the posts while Eli hammered them into the thawing ground. Sweat streaked his temples, and when he caught her watching, he looked away quickly, as though ashamed of something he could not name. Later, when she stumbled carrying a heavy bucket, his hand shot out to catch her elbow. For a heartbeat, they stood close, her breath mixing with his in the cold air. His grip was strong, steady, but when he realized how near they were, he let go as if burned. Neither spoke of it, but that silence now held something charged, an unspoken current that neither dared to name. One evening, Martha sat by the hearth with her Bible unopened on her lap. Eli sat across from her, sharpening a knife with long, slow strokes. The sound filled the room like a steady drumbeat. "You remind me of him," she said suddenly. Eli glanced up, wary. "My husband," she explained. "He carried his burdens quiet, too. Never let me see the hurt until it was too late." Her eyes dropped to the flames. "You've both got that same look, like you're always halfway gone." Eli's knife slowed, his expression unreadable. Finally he said, "And you remind me of my mother. Strong, too strong." The word struck her deeper than she expected. She turned away quickly, blinking at the firelight. That night, Martha dreamed of her husband for the first time in years. He was riding away again, hat tipped low, promising to return before sundown. But in the dream, it was Eli's face that turned back to her before disappearing into the horizon. She woke with her heart pounding, unsure what the dream meant, ashamed of its shape yet unable to deny it. Spring pushed through the valley with tender force. The snow retreated into the mountains, and grass rose green against the earth. For the first time in years, Martha felt her cabin alive again. Not with laughter, not with abundance, but with the steady presence of another soul. Loneliness had been her companion for so long that she hardly recognized its absence. But each evening, when Eli returned from the woodpile or set a rabbit trap along the ridge, she felt the weight inside her chest grow lighter. She told herself it was nothing more than gratitude, nothing more than the comfort of a house not silent. But when their eyes met across the table, and he looked quickly away, she knew there was more. Something fragile, forbidden, but real. Martha stepped outside at dusk, watching the sun bleed red across the mountains. The wind lifted her hair, and she closed her eyes, feeling the vastness of the world pressing down upon them both. Inside, Eli's shadow moved by the hearth, his figure cast long against the cabin wall. The silence that had once been her prison was now their bond, and for the first time in years, Martha Kincaid allowed herself to hope. The wind carried the smell of charred wood that evening, though no fire burned. Eli sat on the cabin's porch, shoulders hunched, the last rays of sun sliding across his face. His hands, usually busy with rope or tools, now lay still in his lap. Martha watched him from inside, the lamplight flickering against her weary eyes. She had seen that stillness before, in soldiers returning broken, in widows standing over fresh graves. It was the look of someone carrying too much silence. The boy had been with her for weeks now. He worked with quiet diligence, chopping wood, until his palms blistered, hauling water until his back ached, and patching fences until the hammer felt like an extension of his hand. But the silence between them weighed heavier than any chore. That night, as coyotes yipped far off across the prairie, Eli finally spoke. His voice was low, scraped raw, as though he had swallowed fire before letting the words come. "My father was white," he said, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "A cattleman. My mother, Shoshone." Martha set down her mending. The thread hung from her needle, trembling in the lamplight. She knew already, in her bones, but hearing it aloud pressed on her chest. Eli's words came slow, jagged, each one torn from a place he had buried deep. Soldiers came last winter. They burned her village. I ran. I saw too much. My mother, my uncles, cousins. He broke off, jaw tightening. I was meant to die with them, but I didn't. And now, I don't know what I am. The silence after was thick, broken only by the hiss of the lamp. Martha rose and stepped toward him, but stopped short. The memory of her own loss flared. Her husband, Daniel, cut down in a feud that began with cattle stolen and ended with blood in the dust. Greed and hatred had claimed him, just as they had claimed Eli's family. "You are alive," she said softly, her voice trembling like old glass. "And that is enough." Eli turned then, his dark eyes glistening in the lamplight. "To them out there, it isn't." He gestured toward the horizon where the town lay. "To them, I'm not enough of anything. Not white, not Indian, just a mongrel to spit on." Martha's throat tightened. She had heard those words whispered in town, too. Half-breed, savage blood. Ugly sounds that clung to the saloon walls like smoke. She hated them then, hearing them echo out of the boy's own mouth. She reached out, hesitated, then laid a hand lightly on his shoulder. His muscles twitched beneath her palm, taut as a drawn bowstring. "They don't know you," she whispered. For a long while, he didn't move, but slowly, his shoulders lowered, just enough to let her hand stay. The days that followed carried a strange gentleness. Eli rose early, fixing what little he could around the homestead. Martha found herself speaking more, telling him stories of Daniel, of the hard winters and lonely nights since his death. She spoke of the way silence had pressed so heavy in the cabin that sometimes she thought it would crush her. Eli listened, his silence no longer empty but full, like the hush before rain. In return, he offered fragments. Not whole stories, but pieces. The taste of pine nut bread his mother baked, the songs she hummed at dusk, the sound of a drum echoing through the valley on summer nights. Each fragment was a wound laid bare, and Martha received them like relics, careful, reverent. Yet as their honesty deepened, something else stirred. Something dangerous. The glances that lingered too long. The way Martha's heart beat louder when he brushed past her carrying a bucket. She told herself it was the loneliness speaking, the hunger for warmth after years of cold silence. But in the quiet hours, she felt the truth pressing against her chest. She was twice his age. The world would never forgive her. And still, his presence lit something inside her she thought had died with Daniel. One night, the wind roared against the cabin walls. Eli sat by the fire, sharpening Daniel's old knife. Martha watched him, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a quilt. The fire painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. "Do you ever hate them?" she asked suddenly. "The soldiers. The men who took everything from you." Eli's hand paused on the blade. His jaw worked, the firelight catching the wet shine in his eyes. "Every day," he said, "and every day I wonder if hating them makes me like them." Martha felt her breath hitch. It was the same thought that haunted her after Daniel's death, when neighbors urged her to take revenge. Hate had nearly consumed her. And now, here was this boy. No, this young man, grappling with the same fire. She leaned forward, her voice breaking. "You are not like them. You carry grief, not cruelty. Don't let them turn you into what they are." Eli looked at her then, truly looked, and for a heartbeat, the air between them was something fragile, trembling, unspoken. But whispers had a way of traveling across the prairie. In town, men spoke of Martha taking in a half-blood boy. Some laughed, some sneered. Others narrowed their eyes, speaking low of unnatural bonds. The frontier was not forgiving, and rumor was its cruelest weapon. Martha felt the weight of those whispers each time she rode in for supplies. Eyes lingered too long. Voices dropped when she passed. Yet when she returned to her cabin, to Eli splitting logs with the winter wind tearing through his hair, she felt the stir of something defiant. He had no one. She had no one. and together, perhaps, they could make something whole out of the broken pieces. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Eli finally said the words he had held back. "I shouldn't stay." His voice cracked, raw with guilt. "If I do, they'll come for you too." Martha's heart clenched. She stepped close, her hand finding his. His skin was rough, scarred, but warm. "Let them come," she whispered. "I've already buried one life. I won't bury another if I can help it." For a moment, silence. The world itself seemed to pause, the prairie wind holding its breath. Eli's eyes searched hers, and though no words passed, something unspoken bound them tighter than any vow. That night, the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Martha sat with Eli in the hush, their grief laid bare, their souls heavy with truths the world would never understand. Outside, the prairie stretched endless beneath a sky heavy with stars. Two lives scarred by loss, stitched together by honesty, sat side by side in a cabin that now carried the sound of something more than survival, something like belonging. And though danger circled them in whispers, in that fragile hour, they felt whole. The fire dies down to embers, sparks lifting into the night like lost souls rising to the stars. Martha and Eli sit in silence, shadows touching but not quite merging, as if the world itself holds its breath around them. The first sign of trouble was not a shout nor a gunshot. It was the smell of whiskey and kerosene carried on the wind. Eli was at the woodpile, the steady rhythm of the axe striking in clean arcs. The thud echoed against the cabin walls, each swing precise, almost meditative. Martha stood at the window, hands in soapy water, watching him. The boy, no, the young man, had grown stronger in the weeks since she found him half dead. His back straightened, his jaw firmer, though his eyes still carried the weight of shadows. Then she saw them, dust rising on the ridge, the silhouettes of riders against the reddening sky. Ranchers. 5, 6, no, more. And leading them, she recognized Harlan Briggs, a man whose mouth always tasted of liquor and cruelty. Her hands froze in the basin. Soap slid through her fingers. By the time Eli noticed the riders, it was too late to hide. The men were already dismounting, boots crunching. Against the dry earth, their faces were hard, their eyes sharpened with suspicion and drink. "Well, well," Harlan sneered, spitting tobacco into the dirt. His gaze shifted from Eli to Martha at the doorway. "Looks like the rumors were true. Widow keeping a half-breed. For company," the others chuckled darkly, though there was no humor in their voices. One man hefted a lantern, its flame licking the glass. Another carried a rope. Eli's knuckles whitened around the axe handle. Martha stepped forward before he could move, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "You'll leave him be." Harlan's grin spread, cruel and mocking. "That boy don't belong here. Word is he's a fugitive. You harbor him. You spit in the face of this town." Martha's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "He's no fugitive. He's a boy who's lost everything. Same as I once did." The men shifted, muttering. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and kerosene, the sharp promise of violence. Inside the cabin, Martha's hands trembled as she lifted Daniel's old rifle from above the hearth. The wood was worn smooth by years of use, but the barrel still gleamed. When she stepped back outside, the rifle leveled steady, the murmurs ceased. "You'd point a gun at your own neighbors, Martha?" one man asked, eyes wide. "I'd point it at any man who dares set fire to my home," she answered, her voice low but clear. The wind stirred the prairie grass. Eli stood silent beside her, axe in hand, torn between stepping forward and holding back. His chest rose and fell quickly, his dark eyes flicking from the mob to Martha. "This ain't right," Harlan snarled, his face twisting. "A woman like you, hiding behind a mongrel. You think he'll keep you warm when the nights turn cold? You think he's worth more than your standing in this town?" The words hit like blows. But Martha didn't flinch. She raised the rifle higher, her finger brushing the trigger. "I've buried one husband because of the hate in this land," she said, her voice breaking but unyielding. "I'll not bury this boy too." The standoff stretched into a silence, so thick the world seemed to hold its breath. The men shifted uneasily. The lantern flame flickered in the dark, threatening to spill fire onto the dry grass. Eli's voice broke the quiet, low and steady. "If it's me you want, I'll go." Martha turned sharply, her chest tightening. "No." His eyes met hers, full of resignation and guilt. "They'll burn you out if I stay." Her hand shook now, but not from fear, from the fury rising in her blood. "You are not leaving," she hissed. "Not again. You hear me? Not again." The men exchanged glances. Some looked away, discomfort flickering across their faces. They had come for a show of strength, but the sight of a widow standing armed against them cracked their bravado. Harlan, however, was not so easily shaken. His lip curled as he took a step forward. "Fine, Martha. If you want to die with him, so be it." He nodded at the man with the lantern. Martha's rifle snapped up, the barrel gleaming in the firelight. "Drop it!" The man froze, hand trembling on the lantern handle. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Eli stepped forward, voice cutting sharp through the night. "You call me a mongrel, a fugitive. Maybe I am, but I won't watch you burn her house for it." The axe head struck the ground, quivering in the dirt. His hands, scarred and strong, clenched at his sides. "You'll have to go through me." The defiance in his stance, the same boy they had once spit at, now standing taller than all of them, unnerved the mob more than Martha's rifle. The prairie wind picked up, rattling dry leaves, carrying with it the sharp smell of kerosene and smoke from distant ranch fires. Sparks seemed to leap in the air, though none had been lit yet. It was as if the land itself threatened to burn. At last, one of the men muttered, "This ain't worth it," and stepped back. Another followed. Their boots scuffed in retreat, their faces uneasy. But Harlan stood firm, jaw tight, fury etched into his veins. He spat at the ground, his voice venomous. "This ain't over, Martha. You protect him. You make yourself our enemy." Martha lowered the rifle slightly, her breath heavy. "Then I am your enemy." The words hung in the air, heavier than bullets. At last, Harlan turned, cursing under his breath. The others mounted their horses, muttering, uncertain. The mob broke apart, leaving only the dust of their departure hanging in the red dusk. When silence returned, Martha's hands sagged against the rifle, her whole body trembled. Eli stepped closer, his face torn between shame and gratitude. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. She turned to him, eyes burning, tears she hadn't meant to shed tracing her face. "I couldn't let them take you. Not after everything. Not after Daniel. Don't you see? I'd rather die with fire at my door than live with this house empty again." For a long moment, they stood in the twilight, the world around them hushed. His hand brushed hers, tentative, fleeting. In that small touch lay the weight of everything they could not say. The horizon burned with the last light of day, sky streaked in red and gold. Martha and Eli stood before the cabin, shadows long and touching as the wind carried the faint echo of the mob's departure. Behind them, the cabin stood unburned, fragile, defiant, alive. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie like a bleeding wound, painting the frost in gold and fire. Martha stood in the doorway of her cabin, shawl wrapped tight, watching the horizon where the mob had vanished hours before. The silence that followed their departure was not peace. It was a verdict. She knew the town would not forget her defiance. They would come again, harder, with law on their side or with more fire in their hands. Behind her, Eli tightened the straps on the small bundle of supplies they could carry: flour, dried beans, a tin of coffee, and the rifle that had spared them for one night more. His movements were quiet, deliberate, but his face betrayed what he felt: guilt, sorrow, and something deeper that neither of them dared name. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice rough with sleeplessness. Martha didn't turn. Her eyes stayed, fixed on the wide expanse of dawn. "If I stay, they'll take this house. If you stay, they'll take your life. There's nothing left for us here." They set out as the sun broke fully over the plains, their shadows long and stretched across the brittle grass. The cabin grew smaller behind them, then disappeared into the folds of the land. Wind tugged at Martha's skirts, carrying the bite of winter still lingering in the mountains. Eli walked ahead at times, testing the path, his shoulders squared against the world. Other times he fell back, letting her set the pace, his eyes watchful, protective in a way that unsettled her and steadied her both. They crossed a shallow river by noon, the ice cracking beneath their boots. Martha's hem grew heavy with water, but Eli offered his hand, steadying her with a gentleness that spoke louder than words. For a moment, she felt the warmth of his grip against the cold, and the silence between them shifted, no longer empty, but full of unspoken understanding. By the second day, the land grew harsher. Hills gave way to jagged rock, the trail narrowing between boulders scorched black by old fires. They passed the remains of a burned camp, ashes scattered, bones half buried. Martha paused, her breath catching at the sight of a child's toy, left charred in the dirt. Eli's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening as he stepped in front of her, shielding her from what little remained of the horror he had already known too well. That night, they camped beneath a stand of pines. The fire was small, their food meager, but the silence felt less heavy than it had in the cabin. Martha stared into the flames, her face lit in flickers of gold and shadow. "You've lost too much," she whispered. Eli's eyes, dark as the spaces between stars, lifted to hers. "So have you." Their words hung in the air, simple and raw, until the wind carried them away into the branches. On the third morning, in a clearing high above the river valley, Martha stopped. The view stretched endless, mountains layered in blue haze, rivers curling silver through the plains, forests swaying under the wind's long breath. The world felt both vast and fragile, as though it might break under the weight of all they carried. Eli stood beside her, silent, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Martha said, her voice trembling, "I've lived half a life waiting for ghosts to leave me alone, but they never did. And now I realize the only way to live is to walk away from them, with you." Eli turned, his expression unreadable at first, then softened with something like wonder. "You'd leave it all, just to walk with me?" She met his gaze, the years between them vanishing like smoke in the wind. "There's nothing to leave. Except you." Hand in hand, they stepped into the clearing, their figures small against the vastness of the west. The sky blazed with the colors of a world being remade, sunlight pouring through the peaks, wind rushing through the grass, river singing in the valley below. Together they walked on, no longer starving for love but sustained by it, side by side across the divide. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from.